This roundtable is called Using Technology to Build Civic Participation. And it was really put together with the intent to stimulate some deeper thought as to whether or not what we are doing in technology around voting, elections, etc., will translate to greater civic and voter engagement, but also what we're doing in social media and other areas. So that's the bottom line, really. Will any of this translate into changed action? Our host and moderator, Allison Fine, is not only a senior fellow at the democracy team at Demos, but also a best-selling and award-winning author who studies and writes about the intersection of social media and social change. Two notable works of hers are Igniting Social Change in the Connected Age and The Networked Nonprofit. Her work directly relates to how technology can ultimately connect voters to a more participatory electoral process. So with that, we'll start the next roundtable, and Allison will do the introductions, and I will join this crowd. Oh, I didn't get a share. How did that happen? Oh, okay, that's all right, that's all right. We'll get that handled. No, stay.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to be here. Can you all see down there? Well, we'll figure it out. Thank you, Susan, wherever she went to, for extending the invitation. And we're going to have a quick conversation up here. We're also willing to take questions at any time. You can go to the mic so the web folks can hear it. I think we can also take questions by Twitter. Isn't that right, Susan? We'll have somebody looking at the stream on Twitter and take questions that way as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask folks questions. I'll give you a little bio as I ask the question, and we'll start there. So so we've got Matt and Matthew, and they're sitting right next to each other.
Just to make it more confusing.
Just to make it more confusing. So I'll get some of it right. So Matt Morse is at Pew, and he's at he's working on the Voting Information Project, and his focus is on military and overseas voting, and he comes from the nonprofit Fair Vote, and his bio is in your materials. Matt, tell us how you're working on using digital technology to reduce the barriers to voting right now.
Yeah, thanks so much. And actually, I think that there was a really great introduction to this point in the first panel of the day, where we had Tom Tarantino and a few other folks talking about how for our generation, my generation, in order to reach us on the civic level, on the voting level, you have to use technology in the same way that that our generation does. And what I mean by that is that the Voting Information Project, which I head up, is essentially the 21st century transmission line between election offices and voters. And we give voters official information to answer their most common questions on Election Day. Things like, where's my polling place? Who's on my ballot? How do I navigate the voting process? Am I registered to vote? We found these are the most basic questions that voters have, and we partner with technology companies, Google, Microsoft, AT&T, in order to get official information where the voters are looking for it. Often, states and as well as a number of localities have these great election websites, but often voters aren't looking there. They're looking on search engines. They're looking on social media and on smartphones. And our goal is to use technology to help make that happen. And over 7 million voters have actually already used the Voting Information Project. And so our goal is to put that information where voters are looking for it to engage them on that level.
This is a great project. I know it's being used widely because it's hitting people right when they need the information, exactly how they need it. Kevin Walston joins us from California State University at Long Beach. I never feel bad for anybody from California in January. And he's focusing now on looking at the impact of web-based applications on democracy, which is such a fast-moving field. Now, Kevin, given what you just heard Matt talk about, would you call that civic participation or civic engagement? And how do we move from one to the other?
Sure, yeah. There's, I think, an open question now about what exactly to make of all this new stuff going on. And, what's that?
Kids are playing with.
Yeah, and, and so I'm a political scientist, and, there's sort of a little bit of a debate going on right now amongst political scientists about what we should make of all this new stuff. So, one sort of critique of the sort of things that I think most of the people in this room are interested in sort of has various names: Facebook activism, clicktivism, slacktivism is the sort of most pejorative one, I think. And the question is, do we want to call things like commenting on a YouTube video or going to a search engine, searching for political information, or joining a Facebook group or signing an e-petition, do we want to call these things political participation? And one concern is that although a lot of people are, in fact, using these things, mostly younger people, in fact, less so as you sort of go a little bit further down the age line, but mostly younger people are doing these things. One concern is that they're going to supplant more traditional and what some people would argue are more effective forms of political participation, traditional things like voting and volunteering and these sorts of things. Not a lot of research suggests that these things have a negative effect, but there is some concern that there's sort of a feel-good factor, right? You go, you join a Facebook group, and you say, oh, look, I can wash my hands, I've done my part, I no longer have to worry about this. There's not a lot of research to back that up, but I think one of the challenges for a lot of people, or a lot of people who are thinking about this, is to try to link these new forms of political participation, which are very popular with younger people, to the sort of classic ladder of engagement. Right now, they're a little bit separated, they're a little bit distinct. So how, I think, can you, in fact, find people where they are, which is online, doing new things, looking for information in new places, and then sort of transition them over to get them involved in some more real-world kinds of things. And I think that's the challenge, right? And for a lot of, there's a lot of excitement and a lot of enthusiasm probably amongst the people in this room, people who I talk to, for new tools, new gadgets, new apps. But without the sort of bridges being built between these things and some of the more traditional ways of organizing people, I think ultimately these things are nice, but not a solution to some of the problems regarding political participation.
Now, I would posit that, to me, we will always have this connection between online on land, right? And the notion of organizers is to understand and activate that connection between the two. We are never going to have democracy entirely online, but no longer are we ever going to have it just on land as well. So we're talking a new world, not necessarily a bad world. They do this a lot with folks. It's not a social media zero-sum game, right? It's not just all bad, all good. There's something in the middle that's happening. Now, Matthew, you've been an activist since you were in college, at Kenyon College in 2007, and now you're running an organization called Our Time and following Bob Dylan around the country at the same time. Sounds very busy. Now, Matthew, your peeps, right? It's always hard to talk in generational terms, but you're a millennial, right?
Yes.
Born pinging and poking and...
I'm 26.
You're 26. God bless you. I remember 26. Right? So here's the thing. Matthew, you do everything on your smartphone, right? I'm guessing. Something like that, right? And then you have a lot of friends who operate that way.
For the most part.
The notion of saying to folks, well, you can live your life online, but in order to be really civically engaged, you've got to come down to the VFW hall and do things the way we've always done that. I imagine that that's anathema for you and your friends. Is that right? How do you feel about that?
In many ways it is. And what's fascinating about it is that our culture is fundamentally at odds with our legislative system and process. And that is a tension that is becoming harder and harder to reconcile unless the legislative process begins to innovate and follow culture, which ultimately it does, because I've always believed that culture leads politics. We've grown up in a day and age of fast food, high-speed internet, and instant results. Now, whether or not you're critical of that doesn't really matter. It's the truth of the matter. We've grown up in that generation, in that culture. So to get someone to fundamentally understand that a bill can take 2 to 3 to 4 legislative sessions to finally even pass one chamber of Congress, I mean, that is completely antiquated, and totally unrelatable to a generation who's used to having fast information and results at their fingertips at all times, at every hour and second of the day. So with that being the scenario, rather than judge it, which we can, and we can argue, is this good for democracy, is this bad for democracy, what I'm more interested in saying is, this is the fact of the matter, so how are we going to engage our generation? And what our time is doing uniquely, in my opinion, is that we've said, rather than try to build a movement of saying there's all these important issues, let's get everyone to just suddenly wake up one morning and realize how important they are, or let's just create fact sheets and try to editorialize the content and hope people follow. I don't think that ever is going to truly build an effective constituency. What our time is doing is starting by meeting young people, as we like to say, on their turf, which is online and through smartphones and through brands, because we live online, in their language, which is through athletes, musicians, celebrities, entertainers, and through deals, which are their wallets, because our generation is pretty much broke, so we are constantly deal hunting and looking for ways we can save money. And if you offer value through deals, and if you offer language that's accessible, and if you offer a way of meeting people where they already are, which is on Tumblr, which is on Twitter and Facebook, and collegehumor.com and Karmaloop, and all these websites where millennials hang out, that's how you can first reach them, to share your message in a relatable, understandable voice. Then, at which point they're in your organization, you have the opportunity to then convert them to more active citizens and engage them around issues that they'll start to understand. But you'll never even reach them unless you go to those mediums. And that's the important thing to definitely emphasize, because unless you go to those mediums, you don't even have a chance. The last thing I'll say about where I think technology is making an amazing difference for the future of political organizing was whether or not, and I don't really care which side anyone's on of the SOPA, Stop Online Privacy or Piracy Act. It was not online privacy. We want to keep that. But nevertheless, it was amazing when Wikipedia shut down.
Yeah.
And
right.
all of a sudden, my younger brother, who's a sophomore at the University of Arizona, cannot do his homework.
You're right.
Now, we can also judge why should he be doing his homework on Wikipedia. But
Right.
the fact of the matter is, people are doing their homework on Wikipedia.
Right.
So you had thousands and thousands of people. And by the way, I realize how many times a day I use Wikipedia to just Google search someone I'm meeting with, or I'm trying to learn about an issue, and you want fast facts. When that site went dark,
Right.
everyone suddenly was like, oh my God, I don't have this site that I wanted. And now I need to learn about this issue because it's on my turf, which is Wikipedia, and I'm going to email my member of Congress through the online submission form that they created, and then all of a sudden, Marco Rubio and all these senators changed their votes, and the bill was essentially delayed and potentially put into the purgatory, which means it will never go anywhere. So it's incredible to see what you can do with technology if it's harnessed correctly. But I think we still have a long way to go in being creative and figuring out how we can take this generation who spends 95% of their time online and get them to ultimately become more politically awakened and active.
Elliot, are you seeing a younger demographic really more engaged on your site, or is it younger than you thought it was going to be? What's going on there?
It's actually, not to be contrarian, but our demographics somewhat are. The plurality of people who've come to Americans Elect are people over the age of 45.
Yep.
And what we've seen is these are the people who've seen election after election go on almost like a slot machine.
Right.
And they're seeing all the challenges the country's facing, and they see nothing on the horizon that's going to offer them some type of substantive change.
Right.
And the vibration we see between the Republican and Democratic Party, I mean, from 2006 to what happened in 2008, then with the president, but then back to 2010, is just this vibration of dissatisfaction, not necessarily a mandate. So our largest demographic are actually, we do have a good representation of younger folks, because I think to Matt's point, that is their turf. But at the same time, the majority of folks who want to get engaged on this, they're getting engaged because they want to see something that's fundamentally different, and the choices that are being put forward to them, they feel like they've seen it before, and the younger folks haven't been through those cycles of disappointment.
Well, they're going through one, but
yeah, but they haven't gone through enough of them yet.
yeah, they'll pile up after a while. It's a good reminder to us, though, that look, the internet revolution is going on 15 years now, and almost everybody is online. The fastest growing segment on Facebook are women over 55. So we should be careful about what assumptions we make about who's online, who's offline. So I was telling my new friends at lunch, my mom carries her cell phone, but doesn't turn it on because she's afraid of using up the battery. However, she's tweeting at home, right? So we can't make assumptions about who's on and who's doing what. But as we know during the Q&A, lots of questions about internet voting in the room and security issues. I'm just curious to get a temperature of the room. Who thinks 10 years from now we're still going to be going down to the elementary school and voting mainly on land 10 years from now? Who thinks that's what it's going to look like? I'm guessing that's about half the room. Other half think we're going to be voting online in 10 years, or mail-in or online in 10 years? Absentee, right, some paper thing you can mail in or online. Right? Susan, tell us about this. This is an issue of great controversy. Tell us, I know you've thought about this and looked at all the different sides of it. What do you think the possibilities of online voting are and the barriers?
Well, that's a huge question.
That's why
I get really nervous about making the wrong statement because I get pressure from all sides. I have the absolute joy of being surrounded by idea people and people in the elections business that want to develop more and see the future and are passionate about it. And I certainly don't want to thwart any of that. We've been hesitant at OVF to endorse any type of internet voting, however, because we do listen to the Tom Rileys of this world from this morning and their sense of caution about balloting online or return balloting online. We've, bet the store on the internet, of course, from the outset, and building tools that could be used by voters and to engage people on the internet. That's our entire shtick. But we actually did draw a line at the internet voting. It's not because I don't believe it might come about. I just am very hesitant if there's the slightest bit of risk that our ballots might be imperceptibly tampered with, which right now is pretty much the case. You really can't get past that part. You might think that an audit will prove that it wasn't tampered with, but it doesn't prove it if the tampering was imperceptible, which can occur, we all know. So right now, I think I'm very curious as to how the Internet Caucus will go with Americans Elect, and not afraid to see how that comes down, but am, again, very cautious to suggest that our balloting move online right now. I advocate do everything possible to use technology to make voting easier and accessible online, every part of it, every aspect of the process. But stop at that one until we're sure. We don't want to regret. We remember 2000 and not being sure of who won the election. We don't want another one of those. So some cautious, we're cautious here.
Matthew, you want to jump in?
Yeah, but the way I see it, which is interesting, is even if you're going to the physical polling precinct and casting a vote generally on a ES&S, Diebold, whatever, electronic voting machine, I mean, haven't there been Princeton studies that show those are just as hackable as an online website? So unless we fundamentally go back to paper ballots, which I think is in some ways going against the cultural grain, although nothing is more important than the integrity of the system. Because if people question the integrity of the system, the whole system is in many ways subverted. But that said, I also, if the physical polling location is just comprised of electronic voting machines, it makes no sense why we shouldn't be able to vote online.
I think the issue is scale. If you had somebody hack into a system and corrupt 2/3 of the ballots, that would be problematic. Anybody else want to jump in? Matt?
Yeah, I mean, at one point, we're talking about millennials and those of us who, to one extent or another, we're all using technology in our day-to-day lives. But one thing that strikes me a lot is that I think one point that we should inject into the conversation is how are we going to reach those who don't use technology on a day-to-day basis? How are we going to bridge this digital divide so that we're not leaving a significant segment of the population behind? And that can be in any conversation, but particularly for voting, are we giving everyone the tools that they need to find the information that they have to have in order to cast a ballot? Online voting is one example, but to speak to the basic questions that voters have, like where's my polling place, making sure that we're not only designing for the Facebook and the smartphone generation. One tool we're working on is a text message tool. So for those who have dumb phones, as some people call them, you can just send a text message and find your polling place instead of having to have more sophisticated technology. So I think that's one thing that I don't want to get lost in the debate here.
I would agree with your sentiment. I think, but something else is, as we talk about who's not getting to vote vis-a-vis technology, there's also the much more significant question of who's not getting to vote or who's not having as significant of a voice just based off of the rules of the game. Right. I mean, there's so many Americans who have absolutely no voice, or the voice that they have is such a fraction of what other people have. I mean, in particular, as a veteran overseas voters, I remember elections where I remember being in Iraq and our ballots didn't get to us. So, we didn't get a vote. I'm a resident of the District of Columbia. I wear that badge with honor. We have very little franchise in this country. So I think it's important to keep in mind, that when you do use technology as a flattener, there is I get asked the question all the time, well, what about people who don't have computers, they don't have a smartphone? And, that's a segment of the population to be sure. I would say they can go to a public library, for instance. But that's not going to be perfect.
Right.
But if we hold up the current system right now, where I think if you live in the state of California, you don't get to cast a primary ballot vote until June.
Right.
This thing's going to be over in June. I mean, it's not going to matter. So I think we have to ask ourselves the question of why do we pick our leaders a certain way? And if you actually look back at the trajectory all the way from the congressional caucus, 2012 is actually the 100th anniversary of the primary in this country. And the trajectory of that has always been one of increased voter participation and voter influence in how we nominate our leaders for who's going to be on the general election ballot. 1972 was the first binding primary. So if we look at the macro, we're actually on what is a very predictable course.
Kevin, give us a response to that and then a projection.
Well, a quick response to that is, without discounting what either of you say, which I think is right on both counts. One thing we should be careful about when we're talking about aggregating preferences online in order to reach some decision, for instance, about who the nominee will be, is that there's a very important skills divide. And I'm reminded of when Obama, with Change.gov, decided we're going to take questions and we're going to vote on the questions. We're going to figure out which issues the American public truly wants to have me address. Now, this was, I think, December 2009. We're in the middle of two wars. We have a struggling economy. And if anybody remembers what the #1 issue was, marijuana, right? In fact, marijuana was 16 of the top 50 priorities.
Right.
And the reason why is because people in the marijuana community, if there is such a thing.
This is the pro-marijuana,
the pro-marijuana
community,
right? We're very skilled at organizing online.
Yep.
Now, just to take this one step further, I don't know how the online caucus will turn out, but I would say that the deck would probably be stacked in favor of Ron Paul given that his constituents have been doing things on Reddit, for instance, to basically organize on his behalf. So there is a sort of the current process is flawed, imperfect, does exclude some people, but new rules are going to favor or advantage people with a certain skill set, and that's something we should be wary of. It's not better or worse, right, because the current system also does that, just for a different group of people.
Right. If I could, 18,000 people have posed questions. The number one issue is the economy.
Okay. Well, that may be true now. We'll see. Yeah. I mean, without.
Go ahead, Susan.
Can I just add, too, that there is this barrier of technology, but there's some other barriers here in the U.S. that we've been seeing increase. I mean, I don't know which is greater, but the rules and regulations for registering to vote in this country are just incredible.
Ridiculous.
And these ID laws are becoming significant barriers. We're seeing more and more on that. I started to just reflect over the last year so much, given what we were doing and the development we were doing, on how overseas and military voters, for me, I feel like we've got it so good. We can go online. We can fill out one form. It works across all the 50 states without controversy. And our ballots come to us online. They have to be ready 45 days before the election. We get help, express mail from the Military Postal Service Agency helped reduce, free from every military base, helped reduce the transit time down to 5.2 days or something. And FedEx jumped in to help civilians return ballots. So every step of the process, of course, we stood up and jumped up and down and screamed for many years, but now we've been helped, okay? We helped ourselves. But I look overseas, and it's a two-step process. It's very state-specific. You want a domestic absentee ballot, some states don't have forms. They don't even have a form. It's so hard to find this stuff. So, we thought, okay, we'll help that. And those are just a few examples. You add the ID thing, you add the physicality of the whole thing. It's tremendously difficult to be involved in the process from that perspective as well as whether or not you have online access or not.
Well, look, I want to encourage people to go to the mics if you have questions. As you're thinking of your questions, I do want to raise the issue of civic engagement, where we started, Kevin. I look at communities, and I know from my work in local communities, one of the difficulties now is that the places that provided civic education in generations before are sorely diminished. So one is schools teach history and government. They don't teach current affairs. They don't teach politics, right? Although everyone encourages voting, that's still different. The League of Women Voters is hurting for volunteers, doesn't have the claim in the communities that it had. The Junior Leagues and the Girl Scouts were organizations that taught civic engagement and volunteerism and volunteer management. So I think that there is a significant civic deficit in communities, and I see this with people who really aren't prepared to lead with civic engagement in their communities now, the backbone of communities. So tell me, who has ideas of, maybe it's one of the mats, of ways that we can make this connection between the rich conversations that are happening online and the deficit we're having on land right now? Matt, you want to help us out?
Sure. One idea that comes to mind is, and this has been going on throughout this conversation, is bridging this online and on land, these activities. And I'm thinking of one really cool application we had for the Voting Information Project, where in 2010 you could take your smartphone, and I don't know how many people check in. You have the Foursquare or various other apps that you can check into specific locations with your phone to tell your friends that where you are. Well, you could check into your polling place, and what I thought was really cool is we took it a step further and we had this digital I voted badge, which is the digital equivalent of the sticker that you get at the polling place. And it turned out that tens of thousands of people ended up checking in, and they shared it on their social networks and through Facebook and Twitter. And as a result, we had this firestorm of hundreds of thousands of people people talking about how they voted, and there was this digital I voted badge that was getting, tossed around, and making sure that, oh, I voted, did my friend Matthew also vote? If not, I got to get in touch with him. And, figuring out how, in some cases, if those conversations aren't happening on land, it may not be that it's because that they aren't happening, it's that they're getting transferred to social media or elsewhere, and thinking about how we can tap into that to make sure that, we're taking account of those conversations as well.
Fair enough.
I think it's important to distinguish that online mediums are oftentimes just a platform for assembling the activism offline. It's not the full extent of the activism. It's not as though you're on Facebook, you have a political conversation, and that's it. If you look at Occupy Wall Street, which was very much physical, on-the-ground activism, much of that was organized originally online, and the necessities of the protesters, the funding mechanisms to aid the protesters, the working groups, the earned media attention were all assembled online, even though the physical presence and energy came offline. So I think, they're not always mutually exclusive. The other things, your earlier point on civic education, which can be enhanced by technology immensely in ways of bringing civics programs back to the classroom at an earlier age, we've essentially marginalized political conversation in public schools today.
Right.
Because of this massive fear that you're indoctrinating our children with liberal or conservative beliefs as opposed to just beliefs as to here's how the system works, here's how, where, why, and when you vote.
Right.
All of us in this room, or the majority of us in this room, truly want to impart election information in the most fundamentally nonpartisan, unbiased way we can. Sometimes, our own editorial opinions might get the better half of us, but for the most part, our intentions are to put nonpartisan, accurate information into the world. If you just let teachers operate with that very assumption that they're operating in good faith with goodwill, I think we'd have a much better state of civic education in this country. Instead, what we've done is make any professor or teacher a pariah if they do a mock election, if they have a conversation about President Obama or President Bush, because it's perceived that they're trying to indoctrinate or proselytize some type of viewpoint. And I think we have to get rid of that, hands-off, no-tolerance rule for political discussion in the classroom. It's going to happen. There's going to be liberal teachers. There's going to be conservative teachers. Everyone decides for themselves. And, you're certainly indoctrinated by your parents growing up in most families, whether it's explicitly, implicitly, or just sort of through the environment you're in. And sometimes you rebel against them, or sometimes you agree with them. But I think people and mature adults can decide for themselves. And so what we need to do is stop viewing civic education as something that, and political discourse in the classroom is something that is somehow partisan.
That's interesting. We have a question here. Yeah.
Hi, this question is mostly for Matthew, but I'd be interested in other opinions as well. One of the easiest ways to allow secure voting on the Internet is if everyone's ballots were published online with their names. So we could say John voted for Smith and Sally voted for Mary, and then anybody can look at the ballots and say, oh, there's no way John would have voted for Smith. John hates Smith. And so I'm wondering whether, given your millennial generation's view of privacy as expressed in Facebook and other similar social sites, whether maybe that is, in fact, the way we solve the problem is we say, to hell with the secret ballot. We don't need a secret ballot anymore. Let's make them all public. And then anybody who wants to can audit the election anytime they want. We can all vote online, and I believe that's probably the only way we can ever safely vote online, but I'm wondering whether that might not only be a possibility, but in fact a practical solution.
What an incredibly thoughtful and provocative question. I actually have never thought about that, and here's what I have to say. For one, I think we're moving toward a culture where privacy is almost gone, if not gone completely 5 years ago, depending on how you look at it. But privacy is so hard to maintain. And even, my personal anecdote, my father hates Facebook. He never wants to join. He's the most private person. He has nothing to hide, but he just likes his privacy. He doesn't have his phone number listed in the phone book or anything. couple weeks ago, I'm on Facebook, and I see these pictures of my father on Facebook, posted on someone else's account, of course. But I said, Dad, do you know you're on Facebook? And he was horrified to think of it. But even if you don't want to be on that medium, you're getting put onto it. So you don't have a choice because the culture is moving there. So I think you might be onto something. The real question is, as someone who obviously fights voter suppression, there are all kinds of, intimidation tactics that are an egregious part of our history with, employers forcing employees to vote a certain way. And with that kind of information being public, there could be peer pressure of people not actually voting who they want to vote for, or just abstaining completely from the process because they're scared to, be the only Democrat in a all-conservative company, or vice versa. And I think that in some ways, to your temperate point of it has its vicissitudes, its ups and downs, whatever it might be, that's a downside to it. But, I'm a pretty outspoken person in my personal capacity, so everyone can verify my ballot and know whether or not I was telling the truth. At least my circle of friends could. And I also think because we live in this social media culture where you communicate and only obtain information through the vantage point of your friends and their recommendations, a la Yelp, a la TripAdvisor, all these sites where you look at what other people have to say in order to make your decision. I think that is an interesting point, and I think it could be in some way where we move if there are safeguards that sort of...
Elliot, now you're headed towards a caucus-type system. Is that of concern that people won't want to raise their hand and say, I'm voting for whomever?
Well, certainly. I mean, but it's not so much a concern as that folks have the ability to opt out. And I think the gentleman's point is a very good one, and it's the direction that we are taking with our caucus, in so much as we're going to be able to audit this process where folks will be able to go back, and you can go with a high level of statistical accuracy to determine whether or not the caucus has had complete integrity or whether or not there's been some hampering. And in this case, it's not Bill or John seeing if Joey voted some way. I know Joey would never vote that way. It's you. Somebody calling you and saying, is this the way that you voted? No, it's not the way that I voted. Or, yes, it is, yes, it is, yes, it is. And you're able to see, all right, there was nothing happened in this. This was done with complete accuracy. Right. But, again, the point of departure is not being able to go back. And I think once you say, we'll never go back, we'll never ask anybody, we'll do the online version of staring at hanging chads because we cannot call the person to ask them if they actually intended to vote that way. I think that is a significant point of departure and one that we're not at yet.
Next question.
The Bipartisan Commission on Federal Elections had the sort of tagline that we should make it easier to vote but harder to cheat. And we've discussed a lot about making it easier to vote, but I was wondering if the panel could discuss how to make it harder to cheat so that those that are eligible to vote can vote, but those that aren't eligible are not allowed to.
And I've always seen the data that I know we talk about cheating, but in actuality, it doesn't really exist. Am I remembering the data correctly? What do you all think? Right? We could spend an awful lot of energy on it.
I've been outspoken on this topic, so I'll go first. I mean, I think the evidence of cheating is negligible. If you look at the amount of convictions and prosecutions under the Department of Justice, I think the real deterrent for voter fraud is the felony conviction and the stiff criminal penalties we have in place to discourage that behavior. Ultimately, it's not that hard to commit a fraudulent vote in this country if you're truly determined to do so. I think the bigger issue is most people don't do it because we have laws and penalties in place for that type of behavior.
I wish people cared that much. Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, my immediate reaction is that I just think it's tragic in this country how much energy goes to keeping people out of the voting process rather than getting them in. And I'm certainly not worried about a non-eligible voter. That would be maybe somebody who did what, did what? They want to participate, and we're not going to let them. I think fundamentally that's wrong. We ought to be figuring out how to get them all participating, not how to keep ineligible voters out.
Kevin, do you have thoughts on this?
I have a couple of thoughts, which I don't know how good they are, but so I teach 17 and 18-year-olds. And I always ask them, how many people here have voted? Inevitably, it's very few, because they're 17 and 18-year-olds, and maybe there hasn't been an election. But one problem I've noticed that we've never had is the problem of underage voting. People sneaking off to vote early. Never happened. I mean, how many people had a drink? How many people tried to underage vote? Nobody. I think I'm just thinking about Elliot's particular concern, and if we're worried about the Americans elect thing in particular, I think we don't need to worry so much about the security of his or the integrity of that particular kind of voting system, because in a way, I think people, part of what Elliot should be concerned about is making sure that the process is good. Otherwise, it'll be a failed experiment. If people do not think that their vote is going to count, that it's actually going to matter, then they probably won't return, and they probably won't support the candidate that emerges from that process, which will be problematic. I think there's sort of a market solution in a way, not to be a free market person on this one, but I think there are ways in which we worry way too much, and then the sort of final thought is as a rhetorical move, sort of using concerns about voter fraud, I think is effective, but I think I would concur with everything that's been said here before. I've never seen actually a serious case of widespread voter fraud, and I think it is sad to...
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I mean, one thing that I hear discussed a lot in parallel to voter fraud is either misinformation, and being from Florida in 2000, I remember all these allegations that people were misled to the polls, or just simply outdated information, that people are getting information that's not current, that maybe there was a change in something at the last minute and you actually have to go vote down the street instead. So I think one potential solution to this is just making sure there's more official information getting out there and that people have access to it.
Well, you're doing a great job of that, because we have a very mobile population combined with very mobile voting sites right now. Not a great combination. Yes, question?
One comment on the privacy point that was made. There's a couple million people who've recently gained the right to vote privately, people in the disabilities community, that feel very strongly about not going backward on the question of privacy. So I think we need to have a bigger conversation when we are talking about that. But I want to go back to the question of civic engagement and the question of how we do the process, because the thing that drives engagement is competitive elections. I mean, there are lots of things we can do, but when you have a hot race, that's when people turn out. And when you have a hot race, you have a lot of emotions and you have close elections. That's a very good time to have paper ballots. Most of the country votes on paper ballots, and we've been headed towards an even greater percentage, more or less, year after year. And having done a few recounts in Minnesota, I would strongly recommend paper ballots. I'd like to know how folks who want to vote online will do recounts of hotly contested, close elections, which are, in fact, what drive civic engagement.
Well, I think, Mark, we can all come to the conclusion of the king of recounts over there successfully. Thank you. What do you all think about his remarks, his question? Anybody?
Who won Iowa? I mean, it's a paper ballot. We have no idea. No idea who won Iowa. So, I mean, I think there are imperfections in each system that we look to. I think it's, it's important to have a system that has integrity. And, I agree with the remarks that, ultimately there is a free marketplace. And if people, especially when we're not talking about the general election, if they feel like their input hasn't mattered or it hasn't contributed in a positive way to the outcome because the system hasn't worked at the end of the day, they don't necessarily have to vote for that person.
I find it remarkable in the voting area, and it's one of the few areas I think that only changes when something really bad goes on, right? That we are so reactive in this. We wait for Florida, we wait for something terrible to go on, and then say, gee, we better get our heads together and fix this thing. Let's flip it over and let's say, okay, we're a bunch of smart folks here and here. What do you want in the next voting system? When my kids go to vote at some point, assuming they can find their shoes and get themselves up out of the house, want these systems to be in the future? What do we want people to be able to do in the future?
At the very least, online voter registration.
Or any registration, Kevin, right?
No, I mean,
Do we have to register to vote?
Assuming that we don't basically take what has been proposed of you turn 18, you're automatically registered, which is something that's been floated around for quite
That's
some
what
time.
I was going to suggest,
Yeah.
is that you are registered because you're a citizen, and the job is just keeping your address up to date.
Right.
And keeping you informed, and that the job of the election official is not wondering whether or not you're on the rolls, but informing you about when is your next election, and, oh, is this still your address? And
Right.
to comment on Mark's point, I mean, I think it's a wonderful point. I think it would be fabulous if there was just the whole country was covered with paper ballots that people could pick up and know. That, that's the most confidence-giving thing. Funnily enough, I mean, people can argue, oh, paper can be fraud too, right? It can be hacked or whatever in its own way. There's some risks there too, but
Right.
From the standpoint, I think, of a Secretary of State or somebody who's in charge of an election, just having the confidence that they can put their hand on that, and it gives a certain feeling.
Tangibleness to
Yeah.
it, right?
Yeah.
Question.
Hi, yes, I vote in Fairfax County, Virginia, and one option that we have is to be able to use the optical scan rather than the wireless. So I always use that, and then I put the look, verify that was how I voted, and put it in to vote. But one idea I had concerning the privacy issue was that since we do have a right to a private vote, that there are many people who have completely open Facebook pages, and they could then those types of people could opt in to have their votes be public, and they could then they could verify that way. Just
That's
an idea.
Interesting. Anybody here from New York? So last year we went from the old machines, right, to the optical scan. What I found amazing was when I went to the optical scan last year, the very nice poll workers, Miss Fanny, took my ballot and helped me put it through the machine and then commented on who I had voted for as opposed to the old machine, right? And I thought, I don't think this is working the way it's supposed to. Right? Oh, yeah, we didn't use that. Yeah, that didn't work. Yeah. She liked my vote, so I felt good about that.
Well, can I say something, too, relating to what Elliot's doing and what Americans Elect is doing? There's, this issue with overseas and military voters where there are 8 states that have caucuses, and we're entirely excluded from that process. So, I mean, this experiment, I'm not going to call it that, this activity of Americans Elect, which I think is really exciting. I mean, we're going to see how that goes, and maybe there's going to be some kernel in there that can help bring about some change for overseas and military voters in isolated cases. I don't know. We'll see. This whole idea of the non-secret ballot is being tested out, all these things that you're doing. It'll be very interesting to see the outcome and to see where that can get applied later and how. This is a long-term issue that it's going to touch on.
That's just it. And you have a huge challenge, Elliot, in educating people on the fact that this is a very exciting idea, but part of a process of experimentation. You don't know how this is going to go. Nobody does. And how do we get people to understand and appreciate that there are going to be things you learn, things that go along unexpectedly. It's not a good or a bad thing. It's just a learning thing.
Well,
do you think it's possible?
The history of our country is a huge democratic experiment.
Right.
And the second we forget that, I'm worried about where we are as a people.
Right.
And especially when we get to a point where our politics are dysfunctional. And I feel on stable ground saying that because the President has said that from the Oval Office on numerous occasions. What we do as Americans is we innovate and we experiment our way to a different sounding. And I think what you brought up, Susan, which is important, is all of the things I've discussed, this entire process. The only thing that Americans elected is really doing that's unique and couldn't be co-opted by either of the 2 major parties is forcing the ticket to be nonpartisan. So the ability of voters to discuss and debate the issues, to weigh in on questions that The candidates have to answer to weigh in on the rules of the convention. You know, there wasn't much of a fuss about the fact that nobody knows who won Iowa, and it doesn't really matter, and there's this uproar, well, can't we challenge this in the courts? Well, the reasons you can't challenge it in the courts is because it comes down to the bylaws of the Republican Party in that in that state. It's not an issue for the courts. It's just a party issue. So these are things we often forget. But you know, we're doing that at American Select, and I think innovation breeds innovation, and there's nothing more American than innovation in the field of democracy.
Matt, where's your project going over the next 3 years, say?
Absolutely. Our goal is ultimately to make sure that any voter who has any question, they can find that where they're looking for it, be it a search engine, a mobile phone, social media, and to not only cover every American anywhere, be it in the United States or overseas, answering those particular questions, but delving actually deep down into the questions themselves. I mean, we've raised a number of them here on this panel. Voter registration deadline, ID requirements, for which candidates am I eligible to vote? Any number of questions like that, and actually taking it even a step further by using this platform to, actually do even cooler things. I mean, we're not just going to provide voter information, but actually help voters along the way. I mean, one perfect example is this, type of tool where you can type in your address and have a pre-populated FWAB, so you can just have a drop-down menu of all the candidates for whom you're eligible to vote. I think that's our ultimate vision is, more apps, more information as well.
So what about a Civic dashboard, Matt, right? So I want to have an app that comes up on my phone or on my desktop, and it tells me what the people I elected are doing, what they're voting for, where their money is coming for at any point in time, what bills they're, promoting, what my school board is doing, all of that in one place. And that will then remind me, elections are coming up. What about that?
It's funny you mentioned that. I actually can't get out ahead of...
I just made it up.
So a partner that we're working with, this isn't a project that Pew is funding, but we're working with a partner who is actually doing just that. And I can't get out ahead of them and announce it, but I think in the next couple of weeks there will be something that answers a lot of those questions and delves deep into that information that will be coming down the line.
That to me is how we get from online to on land, right? That's the nexus of when I have enough good information about what's happening in my area democratically, then I can go on land and join a meeting and find out what the school board is doing and so on. Kevin, over the next 2 years, what questions do you want to ask and answer in your work?
Oh, in my work. Well, I'll redirect the question a little bit because there's something I sort of wanted to speak to. I think we're entering, and this goes to a lot of academic research that's been done. I think we're in an age of uncertainty right now, which is everything might work. We know that everything will not work, but everything might work. So dashboards and Americans Elect and everything else. If you think about the history of the role of the Internet in political participation, I mean, every single election since 1996 has been the year of the Internet. 96, it was the website. 98, it was Jesse Ventura. 2000, it was Dean. 2000, it was McCain's fundraising. 2004, Dean. 06, the Macaca moment. 08, Obama. Did these claims of it being the Internet year lack historical nuance? No. It's been true every time because the state of innovation on the Internet is such that the Internet is a fundamentally different place in 2008 than it was in 2000. And it will be a fundamentally different place in 2012 than it was in even 2008. One of my favorite articles of all time is a 1995 New York Times Magazine article called "This is Sex?" with a question mark. And the argument was essentially, look, porn on the Internet's never going to go anywhere. It's so slow, it's grainy. What a disappointment. And every academic study that's been done essentially on the Internet is basically this is politics. Because a lot of work on 2000 and 2002 and 2004 looked at campaign websites and they said, look, these are pitched at the median voter. Nobody visits them except for the people who are already interested in the candidate. In short, we shouldn't expect these things to revolutionize democracy. Now, what I would expect is that because of things like the dashboard and because what we're getting is the opportunity to take data and wet it to things like Facebook apps that will allow more targeted kinds of mobilizations, more effective kinds of mobilizations, that what we've learned from 2006, 2008 will not be true in 2012. So to go to the question of my work, what do I want to do? I want to see what's different in 2012 than in 2008. Whether or not what we thought we knew about the internet and politics remains true. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, I can't predict. Obviously, you know, if I could predict, I probably wouldn't be a professor. I would be somebody with some power and fame or whatever. But I'm not. But experiments like Eliot's, I think, are you know, they force us to address this question. Ultimately, whether it succeeds or fails will be a learning experience. But I think we're moving towards a more effective kind of internet.
I would have been sorely disappointed, Kevin, if we went an entire hour without somebody bringing up porn. So I appreciate that.
No, I wasn't going to let it pass. I mean, it's my goal, really, in every conversation.
Elliot, I've been thinking, well, and to think you're not famous yet. I don't get it. I really don't.
Maybe that'll change.
Elliot, something really fascinating on the social movements the past couple of years, as Matthew brought them up a little while ago, is that every one of those movements was powered by individuals who were extra-organizational, not the heads of unions or the heads of political parties or the heads of governments or the heads of nonprofit organizations, just what I call free agent individuals, whether it's Egypt or Occupy Wall Street. Do you envision a time on an effort like yours where political party isn't of relevance at all? You don't have to worry about balancing this party, that party. It's just non-party.
I think there's a number of groups that are taking steps in those directions. I mean, you know, you have Americans Elect View organizations like Ruckus, Vodacin. You know, there is a whole chunk of people who are reimagining the way that we interact with our politics and express ourselves politically, and it is outside of the party.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just look at the trends, I mean, the parties are bleeding membership.
Right.
You know, we have, I think, David Brooks penned a column probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. He noted that we have 2 minority parties in this country,
right,
and referred to them as the 2 moons.
Right.
And I would have to agree. I think that's an apt representation of where we are.
I think it's easy to say the party system is going the way of poor Miss Fanny at my polling place, right, whom I adore, although I don't like parties so much, but I adore her. Susan, last word. Any thoughts of what you hope to learn this year?
I want to go back to something that Tom Tarantino from IAVA said in the first panel. Where he said, you know, you got about 60 seconds to get any of us. He, speaking as a military voter and what it would be like if he opened up the internet and tried to do something. He said, you got about 60 seconds to get us. You know, you don't do it in that time. I think it's probably about 10 seconds, actually. I'd like to be able to master that. And so that, I mean, there's so much to offer right now online, but to be able to not just offer new things to existing voters, but to create new voters entirely by using the internet. That's our goal. And if we can do that, I think we're on the right track. And we're also got...
And we're at Matthew, 30 seconds, last thoughts. I want to give him a fair shake.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see how the internet can be used as a gathering place to build constituency. And that is obviously, you know, my organization, Elliot's organization, we're both working on those kinds of issues. And, you know, I think to Elliot's point that the political parties are becoming more minorities. They're also becoming egregious monopolies who cannibalize competition and new ideas in between them. And I think our goal we have is to ensure that the ideas and perspectives of young people are actually something that can rise to the top and be represented, as opposed to just have to feed into an existing, perhaps antiquated infrastructure.
Exactly. There you go. Thank you all very, very much. It's been a pleasure.